My name is Claire Dawson, and when I was 17, my stepfather fractured my skull with one careless, violent act. When I begged for help, my own mother told me to stop lying, that I was exaggerating and seeking attention. But the truth came out the moment a brain surgeon looked at my scans, and from that day forward, nothing in my life would ever be the same. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It's strange to look back and realize how many signs had been there all along, the little red flags that I had either ignored or tried to normalize because I wanted so badly for our home to feel like a real family. My stepfather, Gerald, came into our lives when I was 12. By then, my dad had been gone for years, leaving behind a shadow in the form of unpaid bills and promises never kept. My mom, Linda, was a woman who hated being alone. So, when Gerald appeared, a man who had a steady job at the paper mill and a charming laugh that carried across any room, she latched onto him like he was a lifeline. At first, he was kind to me. He would bring me little gifts, a notebook for school, or a chocolate bar he said I picked up just because. And I wanted to believe he cared. I wanted to believe my mom had finally found someone who could steady the storm. But the truth about Gerald didn't reveal itself all at once. It came in fragments, the kind you almost miss if you're not paying attention. The sharpness in his voice when I didn't move fast enough. The way he grabbed my arm a little too hard if I ever dared talk back. The look of disdain that crossed his face when I achieved something at school that made me proud. To him, I was competition for my mom's attention, not a child he was supposed to protect. By the time I reached my junior year in high school, the tension in our house had become something you could taste in the air. I kept my head down, tried to stay out of his way, and filled my life with extracurriculars so I wouldn't have to spend too much time at home. I worked on the yearbook committee, joined the debate team, and even started volunteering at the library just to carve out spaces of peace. But the house was still where I had to sleep, and Gerald never let me forget that it was his roof over my head. The night that changed everything was a Tuesday in late March, just after dinner. I had gotten an A on my U.S. history essay, and I was proud enough to want to share it with my mom. Gerald sat at the table nursing his usual beer, watching the local news with that half-interested look he always wore. I held up the essay, smiling, and said, "Mom, look, Mr. Hall said this was one of the best in the class." She smiled faintly, distracted, and Gerald muttered something under his breath that sounded like teacher's pet. I ignored it at first. I had learned long ago that if I responded, things escalated. But that night, maybe I was tired, or maybe I had grown too weary of shrinking myself down. I muttered back, "At least I'm doing something with my life." The chair screeched against the tile before I even realized what was happening. He rose to his feet, towering over me, and the next thing I felt was the sting of his hand across my face. It wasn't the first time he had hit me, but what followed was. In a blur of rage, he shoved me backward. My head hit the corner of the counter with a crack so loud it seemed to echo in my ears. Pain exploded, white and blinding, and for a moment the world tilted sideways. I remember lying on the cold kitchen floor, my breath shallow, my vision tunneling. Blood trickled warm down the side of my face, and my mother's gasp cut through the ringing in my ears. But instead of running to me, instead of screaming for Gerald to stop, she stood frozen, her eyes darting between us. "Linda," Gerald barked, his voice edged with steel. She slipped. She was being dramatic again. And then, unbelievably, my mom nodded. She knelt beside me, her hands trembling as she dabbed at my forehead with a dish towel. "Claire, stop lying. You fell, okay? You fell. Don't make this worse." In that moment, something inside me cracked wider than the bone in my skull. I realized my mother wasn't going to save me. She was choosing him, his version of the truth, over her own daughter's pain. The betrayal hurt more than the injury. By the next morning, my head throbbed with a pressure I had never known before. I tried to get out of bed, but nausea gripped me, and I collapsed to the floor. My mom called Gerald at work, sounding exasperated rather than alarmed. "She's still pretending," she sighed into the phone, as if I was staging some grand performance just to spite them both.
But at school, my English teacher noticed something was wrong. I had forced myself to show up because I thought maybe keeping up appearances would help. But halfway through class, I slumped against the desk. My words slurred when I tried to answer a question, and that was when she called the nurse. Within an hour, I was in the back of an ambulance, the world around me fading in and out. I would later learn that the CT scan showed a depressed skull fracture pressing dangerously close to the surface of my brain. The ER doctor had immediately paged a neurosurgeon. That surgeon, the one who would later change the entire course of my life, looked at my scans, then at me, and said words I'll never forget. "This wasn't an accident. Someone did this to you." And just like that, the lies Gerald and my mother had tried to stack around me like walls began to crumble. For the first time, someone in authority saw me, believed me, and said out loud what I had been too afraid to scream. I wasn't making this up. Growing up, I used to imagine that my life was like everyone else's, that behind closed doors, all families had some secret messiness they didn't talk about. I convinced myself that the yelling in our kitchen, the slammed doors that rattled the frames, and the sharp stings of Gerald's temper were just part of being in a blended family. I told myself it was normal that I felt my stomach clench every time I heard his truck pull into the driveway. But the truth was, our house wasn't just a little messy, it was toxic. Gerald's presence had turned what should have been a sanctuary into a place I dreaded coming home to every day. Gerald had this strange ability to wear two faces. In public, he was polite, even charming. Neighbors thought he was hardworking and dependable, the kind of man who'd shovel their driveway after a snowstorm or wave cheerfully while taking out the trash. He played the role so well that people admired him. To them, he was the man who had stepped in to take care of a single mother and her daughter, a selfless provider who brought stability into our lives. But at home, once the front door shut, he changed. He was controlling and short-tempered, especially with me. If I didn't fold the laundry perfectly, he'd dump the basket onto the floor and snare, "Do it right this time." If I left a dish in the sink, he'd smack the back of my head hard enough to make my eyes water. My mom, instead of protecting me, always made excuses. "He just wants things done properly," she'd say softly, like she was explaining away the weather. What hurt the most wasn't the punishments themselves, it was how invisible my pain became. Every time Gerald lashed out, I looked to my mom, expecting her to step in, to shield me. But she never did. She'd look away, wring her hands, and whisper, "Claire, just don't provoke him." I couldn't understand why she tolerated it. Sometimes I wondered if she was afraid of him too, or if she simply wanted so badly to keep him around that she was willing to sacrifice me in the process. Either way, it left me feeling abandoned in my own home. Over the years, I developed coping mechanisms without even realizing it. I learned to move silently through the house, tiptoeing up the stairs so he wouldn't hear me. I kept a mental checklist of what mood he was in, based on the heaviness of his footsteps or how hard he slammed the car door outside. If he was in a good mood, I breathed easier, even dared to ask my mom to help me with homework. If he was in one of his darker moods, I stayed in my room, hungry, but unwilling to risk going downstairs for dinner.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. School became my escape. There, I could be someone else, someone who smiled and laughed with friends, someone who was praised for her essays and speeches. My teachers saw potential in me, potential that Gerald worked tirelessly to diminish. He'd scoff at my debate team trophies and call them plastic junk. He'd roll his eyes when I talked about applying to college, saying, "You'll never make it out there on your own. You're too soft." Those words dug under my skin, but I refused to show him how much they hurt. I held on to the encouragement of my teachers, the pride in my own accomplishments, like tiny lifeboats in a storm. Still, every night when I came home, the storm waited for me. And it wasn't just the physical intimidation or the belittling words. It was the constant gaslighting. If I cried after he hit me, he'd tell me I was too sensitive. If I tried to defend myself, he'd twist my words until I doubted my own memory. He was skilled at making me feel like I was losing my mind, like I couldn't trust myself. And my mom, who should have been my anchor, reinforced his lies. Whenever I confronted her, begging her to believe me, she'd sigh and say, "Claire, you always exaggerate. Gerald's strict, but he loves us. You'll understand when you're older." That was the real prison, being told over and over that my reality wasn't real. I started journaling late at night, scribbling down exactly what had happened each day so that I'd have some record of the truth. Sometimes I wondered if one day I'd need to show it to someone else, someone who could finally understand what was going on behind our closed doors. By the time of the injury, the fracture that nearly ended everything, the pattern had been deeply established. Gerald's violence wasn't new, but it had escalated. What used to be slaps on the arm or shoves when I didn't move quickly enough had grown into full-blown hits and violent shoving. And every escalation was followed by the same cover-up. Gerald telling my mom it wasn't as bad as it looked, and my mom assuring me it was just an accident. I began to feel like a ghost in my own life, like the truth lived only inside me and nowhere else. I also noticed how isolated I had become. I couldn't bring friends over because I was terrified Gerald would snap in front of them. I stopped talking to my aunt, who used to call every Sunday, because Gerald always hovered nearby when I was on the phone, and my words dried up under his watch. Even at school, though my teachers sensed something was wrong, I kept my answers vague. How could I explain that my stepfather hit me and my mom told me to shut up about it? It sounded too outrageous to be true. Looking back now, I realized that the hidden problem wasn't just Gerald's abuse. It was the way my mom reinforced his lies. She had become an accomplice, whether out of fear, denial, or love, and that betrayal cut deeper than anything else. It left me feeling unmoored, like I didn't have a single adult in my corner. And that's what made me so vulnerable when the breaking point came. I had been conditioned to believe that no one would believe me, that speaking the truth would only make things worse. But even with all those layers of silence and denial pressing down on me, part of me still clung to hope. I held on to the dream of leaving for college, of building a life far away where Gerald's voice couldn't reach me, and my mom's excuses couldn't drown me out. I didn't know it then, but the events that followed, the injury, the hospital, the surgeon's words, would finally crack the facade they had built around me. The truth I had been forced to bury would finally see the light of day. The day that became my breaking point didn't start any different from the others. It was a Wednesday morning in early April, cool and gray outside, the kind of weather that makes you want to stay under the covers. I was already on edge because Gerald had been stomping around the house the night before, angry about something at work. Whenever he had a bad shift at the mill, we all paid for it. I tried to keep quiet that morning, slipping through the kitchen to grab a piece of toast before school. My mom sat at the table, drinking coffee, her face pale from lack of sleep. Gerald was already up, grumbling as he looked through the bills. I thought maybe if I just kept my head down, I could make it out the door without trouble. But Gerald had other plans. "Where's my thermos?" he barked, rifling through a drawer. I froze because I knew what that tone meant. It didn't matter if I had nothing to do with it. I would be the target. "Claire, you use it for your stupid tea again?" His eyes locked on me, sharp and accusing.
I shook my head quickly. No, I haven't touched it. My voice was steady, but my hands trembled as I gripped my backpack straps.
Gerald slammed the drawer shut and walked toward me, his face flushed red, his steps heavy. Don't lie to me, girl. You think you can play me for a fool? I looked desperately at my mom, hoping she'd intervene, but she just looked down at her mug, refusing to meet my eyes. My heart pounded, that familiar dread flooding my chest. I don't know what gave me the courage in that moment. Maybe it was exhaustion from years of swallowing my words, but something snapped inside me. I said quietly, "Why do you always blame me for everything? It's not my fault you can't keep track of your stuff." The room went still. My mom's head jerked up, her mouth opening as if to stop me, but it was too late. Gerald's hand shot out and grabbed my arm, squeezing so tight I thought the bone might snap. His eyes were wild, a mix of rage and disbelief that I had dared to talk back. "You ungrateful brat," he growled, shoving me backward. My shoulder hit the fridge, and before I could steady myself, he shoved again, harder. My head whipped back and struck the edge of the counter with a sickening crack. Pain burst across my skull like fireworks exploding behind my eyes. For a split second, I thought I heard glass shatter, but it was only the sound of my own body betraying me. My legs gave out, and I crumpled onto the kitchen floor. The pain was unbearable, sharp and heavy all at once, like my head was caught in a vice. My vision blurred, and I tasted blood where I'd bitten my tongue. My mom gasped, her coffee spilling onto the table. But then came Gerald's voice, steady, commanding, already rewriting the story. "She slipped," he said firmly. "She was rushing and she slipped." He looked directly at my mother, daring her to contradict him. Tears stung my eyes as I looked up at her. "Mom, he pushed me." My words came out slurred, thick with fear and pain. She knelt beside me, her hands shaking as she dabbed at the blood trickling down my temple with a napkin. "Claire, stop lying," she whispered urgently, glancing up at Gerald as if to reassure him. "You fell, that's all. Don't make this worse." In that moment, something inside me broke, not just the bone in my skull, but the last fragile thread of trust I had in my mother. Her denial wasn't just silence anymore, it was active betrayal. The man who hurt me was standing right there, and she was protecting him instead of me. I wanted to scream, but the pain made it impossible. I lay there, the kitchen spinning, while my stepfather muttered about how dramatic I was being, how I needed to toughen up. The hours that followed were a blur. I stumbled through the school day in a fog of pain, clutching the side of my head. Every sound was too loud, every light too bright. My classmates noticed I wasn't myself, but I brushed off their questions. I knew if I told the truth, no one would believe me, not when my own mother called me a liar. I kept telling myself it would pass, that maybe it was just a bad bruise. But during third period English, as I sat trying to focus on the words in my book, the room tilted. My teacher, Mrs. Randall, called on me to read a passage, and when I opened my mouth, the words came out jumbled. My classmates stared as I struggled to form a sentence, my tongue heavy and clumsy. Mrs. Randall hurried to my desk, her face tight with concern. "Claire, are you all right?" But I couldn't answer. My body felt like it wasn't mine anymore, my limbs heavy and unresponsive. Within minutes, the school nurse was called. I remember lying on the cot, clutching my head, trying not to vomit as the fluorescent lights bored down on me. The nurse pressed cool fingers to my forehead, her voice urgent as she called an ambulance. "Possible head trauma. Student is disoriented, slurred speech." I wanted to protest, to say I was fine, but the words wouldn't come. By the time the EMTs arrived, I was drifting in and out of consciousness. They lifted me onto a stretcher, and I remember the concerned faces of my classmates peeking through the doorway, their whispers following me out of the school. For the first time,
Adults other than my mother were taking my pain seriously, and a flicker of hope stirred in my chest, even as fear clawed at me.
The ride to the hospital was a haze of sirens and oxygen masks. One of the EMTs asked me how I got hurt. I wanted to tell him the truth, but the image of my mother's eyes, cold, dismissive, telling me to stop lying, flashed in my mind. So I just shook my head weakly.
When we arrived at the emergency room, everything moved fast. Doctors swarmed around me, nurses adjusted IVs, and bright lights blurred above me. They sent me for a CT scan, the machine humming loudly as it took images of my fractured skull. When the neurosurgeon arrived, he didn't look at me like I was a liar or a burden. He looked at me like someone who mattered, someone whose pain was real. After studying the scans, he said words that cut through all the fog. This wasn't from a simple fall. The fracture shows forceful impact. Someone hurt you. And just like that, the walls Gerald and my mother had built to trap me in silence began to crack. Someone finally saw the truth. Someone believed me. When I woke up in the hospital bed, everything felt disjointed, like the world had shifted on its axis. The lights were softer than at school, and the antiseptic smell filled my nose. My head throbbed, but the pain was less blinding than before, dulled by medication. For a moment, I thought I had dreamed it all. The shove, the crack of my skull against the counter, my mother's cold denial. But then I touched the bandages wrapped around my head, and reality came crashing back. I wasn't home. I was in a place where people couldn't ignore what had happened to me. A nurse appeared at my side almost immediately, smiling warmly. "Claire, you're awake," she said softly, adjusting the IV line. Her tone carried the weight of genuine concern, something I wasn't used to. "How's your pain?" she asked, and I whispered that it was better than before. For the first time in a long time, someone seemed to truly care about how I felt, not about how I looked to outsiders. But the relief was short-lived. A sharp pang of dread hit me when the door opened and I saw my mother walk in, Gerald looming behind her. My mom's face was tight, her eyes darting around nervously. Gerald wore that fake, polished expression he used in public, the one that fooled everyone else. He even carried a bouquet of cheap flowers, like he was some doting stepfather coming to check on his stepdaughter after a clumsy accident. "Claire," my mom said softly, her voice trembling. Gerald stepped closer, placing the flowers on the table beside my bed. His smile was wide, rehearsed. "You gave us quite a scare, kiddo," he said, reaching to pat my arm. Instinctively, I flinched back. He noticed it was quick, but I saw the flicker of irritation in his eyes before he masked it again. "Doctors said you hit your head pretty bad," he continued smoothly, "but you're tough. You'll be fine." I wanted to scream, to tell the nurse, the doctors, anyone that this man had put me here. But the weight of my mother's warning from the night before still echoed in my head. "Stop lying. Don't make this worse." I couldn't shake the fear that if I spoke up, they'd both gang up on me again, paint me as dramatic or delusional. And what if the doctors didn't believe me either? What if they sent me home with him? But fate was about to intervene in a way I hadn't expected. Later that day, Dr. Robert Keene, the neurosurgeon, came into the room. He was a tall man, in his 40s, with calm eyes that seemed to see straight through the layers of lies. He carried a stack of scans under his arm, and when he looked at me, his gaze softened. "Claire, I've reviewed your CT results," he began, his voice steady. He glanced at my mom and Gerald, who had stiffened at his entrance. My mom forced a smile, trying to sound casual. "Yes, doctor, thank you. She's always been a little clumsy, our Claire. Fell right in the kitchen this time." Gerald nodded in agreement, his arm draped casually around my mom.
But Dr. Keene didn't smile back. Instead, he laid the scans down on the bedside table and pointed at the images. "This isn't consistent with a simple fall," he said firmly. "The fracture here," he traced a dark line on the film, "shows a direct impact from significant force. It's not the type of injury one gets from just slipping." The room went quiet. My mother's face drained of color. Gerald's jaw tightened, and his hand gripped the arm of the chair so hard his knuckles turned white. "What are you implying, doctor?" Gerald asked, his voice calm but edged with threat. "I'm not implying. I'm stating a medical fact. Claire's injury is consistent with an assault, not an accident." He turned his gaze back to me, his voice softening again. "Claire, I need to know exactly what happened. Your health and safety depend on it." The silence was suffocating. I felt Gerald's stare burning into me, warning me not to open my mouth. My mother's eyes were pleading, begging me silently to keep the secret, to protect the illusion of our family. My throat tightened, fear clawing at me, but Dr. Keene didn't look away. His calm, unwavering expression told me I wasn't crazy, that someone finally saw what was happening.
I fell, I whispered weakly, the words tasting bitter. The moment they left my mouth, I hated myself for saying them. My mom exhaled in relief, while Gerald leaned back in his chair, his fake smile returning. But Dr. Keene didn't look convinced. He studied me closely, then said, "All right, we'll make sure you're safe here for now. But Claire, if you remember anything else, you can always tell me, no matter what." That small sentence felt like a lifeline tossed into stormy waters. He knew. He couldn't say it outright yet, not without my cooperation, but he wasn't fooled. For the first time, I realized there was someone in my corner, someone who could dismantle the web of lies Gerald had spun around me. After they left, the nurse came back in, adjusting my IV. She gave me a look I couldn't quite decipher, but her voice was gentle when she said, "Don't worry, sweetheart. You're in good hands now." Her tone suggested she knew more than she was saying, and I clung to that hint of solidarity. Outside eyes had finally seen the truth. For years, I had been screaming silently, my pain dismissed as exaggeration, my bruises explained away. But now, someone with authority, with evidence, had spoken the words I couldn't. This wasn't an accident. And once that suspicion had been voiced, there was no going back. What I didn't know then was that Dr. Keene's insistence would set off a chain reaction, an investigation, questions I had never dared imagine being asked, and a pressure that would force the carefully constructed lies of my household to unravel one by one. Gerald had always controlled the narrative. My mother had always backed him. But now, the truth had a witness, and that changed everything. The days that followed felt like I was balancing on the edge of two worlds, the one Gerald and my mother desperately tried to keep intact, and the one that Dr. Keene and the medical staff were steadily uncovering. I remained in the hospital under close observation, hooked up to machines that beeped softly through the night. Every time I drifted in and out of sleep, I'd hear snippets of voices, the nurses at their station, the distant rolling of carts down the hallway, the hum of life outside my small room. But beneath those ordinary sounds was the growing sense that something had shifted. For the first time, someone had questioned Gerald's story. That small crack in their facade terrified him, and in turn, it terrified my mother. On the third day, Dr. Keene returned with a clipboard in hand. He didn't come alone this time. Another physician and a social worker followed him into the room. The social worker introduced herself as Mrs. Alvarez, a middle-aged woman with kind but penetrating eyes. "Claire," she said, pulling a chair close to my bed, "we want to talk with you about your injury. Just you and me for a bit, all right?" She gave my mom and Gerald a pointed look, and for once, they had no choice but to leave the room. I watched Gerald's jaw tighten as he stepped out, his hand firmly pressing into my mother's shoulder like a warning. When the door closed, Mrs. Alvarez's expression softened.
Sweetheart, I know it can be scary to talk about things that happen at home, but I want you to understand something important. You are safe here. No one can hurt you while you're in this hospital, and what you tell us will help us protect you. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to pour everything out, the years of slaps, the shoves, the words meant to shrink me into nothing, but my throat closed up. Fear sat on my chest like a stone. I whispered, "It was an accident." I slipped. Even as I said it, my heart ached with the lie. Mrs. Alvarez didn't push me, though. She just nodded gently. "All right, but remember what Dr. Keene said. The kind of injury you have doesn't usually come from a slip. If you ever feel ready to share, we'll listen." She handed me a small card with her name and number on it. "Keep this. If you ever need me, just call."
Later that evening, after Gerald and my mom left for the night, a nurse named Hannah lingered by my bedside. She was young, maybe in her 20s, with freckles across her cheeks. She adjusted my IV, then lowered her voice. "You don't have to say anything if you're not ready," she whispered, "but I see this kind of thing more often than you'd think. You're not alone." Her words sent shivers down my spine. Not alone. For years, I had believed I was the only one living this nightmare. Hearing her say it, without judgment, without doubt, lit a tiny flame of courage in me.
Meanwhile, Gerald seemed to sense the walls closing in. When he visited, his charm was turned up to full volume, but I could see the cracks in his performance. He brought my favorite snacks, joked with the nurses, and kept up the role of the concerned stepfather. But when the room emptied and he leaned close to me, his eyes darkened. "Remember," he hissed under his breath, "you tell them you slipped. You tell them you're clumsy. Because if you don't, Claire, you won't like what happens when you come home." His voice was low, controlled, the kind of voice that didn't need to yell to terrify. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, torn between two choices: silence and survival, or truth and danger. I thought about my journals at home, hidden under my mattress, filled with entries documenting years of abuse. If someone found them, they would know I wasn't lying, but Gerald would destroy them the moment he suspected I'd talked. The investigation began quietly but firmly. Dr. Keene documented his findings in my medical file, making it clear that my injuries were consistent with abuse. Mrs. Alvarez made several visits, each time gently reminding me that I had options. She asked about school, about friends, about my life outside the house, weaving her questions carefully so I wouldn't feel trapped. Slowly, she was building a case, piece by piece, even without my full confession. Meanwhile, at school, word had spread about my hospitalization. Mrs. Randall, my English teacher, had already expressed concern to the principal after the incident in class. When she learned about my skull fracture, she began keeping detailed notes about the times I had come to school with bruises or exhaustion. It turned out others had noticed more than I realized. Friends recalling how I often wore long sleeves even in warm weather. Teachers remembering how I flinched when someone raised their voice. These small details, when pieced together, began forming a larger picture. Still, the fear in me was relentless. I felt like I was walking a tightrope. One wrong move, one slip of the tongue, and Gerald would retaliate. My mother's silence only deepened my despair. She visited daily, sitting at my bedside with forced smiles, but when I tried to meet her eyes, all I saw was guilt and denial. Once I whispered, "Mom, please, you know what he did." She shook her head quickly, gripping my hand too tightly. "Don't," she said through clenched teeth. "You will ruin everything. Just let it go." But letting it go was no longer an option. The evidence was piling up, and the outside eyes watching me were no longer blinded by Gerald's act. Every scan, every note, every concerned witness was another crack in the wall he had built. And though I was still too afraid to shout the truth, I began to realize something important. The truth no longer depended entirely on me. Others had begun to see it for themselves. One evening, Dr. Keene visited again, pulling a chair close to my bed. "Claire," he said quietly, "we're documenting everything. We can't force you to speak before you're ready, but know this, your silence doesn't erase the truth. It's already here, in these scans, in the medical reports, and sooner or later, it will come out." His words resonated deep inside me. For so long, Gerald had convinced me that my voice didn't matter, that without it, nothing I said could ever change reality. But now I was beginning to understand that the truth had a weight of its own, one even Gerald couldn't control. That realization was terrifying, but it was also the first spark of hope I had felt in years. The hospital walls became both a prison and a sanctuary, keeping me trapped in limbo between my old life under Gerald's control and the possibility of something different. Days stretched into nights filled with restless half-sleep, my mind buzzing with questions I was too afraid to answer aloud. Then one morning, everything began to shift. It started with a knock on the door, followed by Dr. Keene entering with a man and woman in professional attire. The man introduced himself as Detective Ross, his partner as Detective Haley. Their badges caught the sterile light of the room, and my heart sank into my stomach. Gerald had always warned me that if the police got involved, life would get worse. But at the same time, seeing them felt like a lifeline thrown into an ocean I had been drowning in for years. They sat down, keeping their tone gentle. "Clara," Detective Ross began, "we've been asked to look into the circumstances of your injury. We're not here to pressure you. We just want to make sure you're safe." His words were almost identical to Mrs. Alvarez's, but coming from someone in uniform, they felt heavier, more final. They asked a few questions: where I fell, how it happened, who was home at the time. I gave the same rehearsed answers Gerald had drilled into me. But the detectives didn't look convinced. Haley leaned forward slightly and said, "The doctors tell us that what happened to you doesn't line up with a fall. That kind of fracture usually comes from a strong blow. We know this isn't easy, but we need you to know you're not in trouble."
My throat tightened. The words I wanted to speak were there, pressing against the back of my teeth, but they refused to come out. I thought of Gerald's eyes, cold and sharp as knives, and my mother's trembling voice telling me to stay quiet. Instead of telling them everything, I shook my head. "It was just an accident," I whispered. I saw the disappointment flicker in their eyes, but neither detective pushed me further. They thanked me for my time, leaving me with their cards. "If you ever feel ready, you can call us directly," Haley said softly before walking out. My hands trembled as I tucked the card under my pillow, as if hiding it could also hide the choice I would someday have to make. What I didn't know then was that the police weren't going to rely solely on my testimony. They began their own digging. That afternoon, Mrs. Randall was called in for questioning. She shared her growing concerns about my behavior at school, the bruises I tried to hide, the way I flinched. Another teacher recalled seeing Gerald pick me up once and noticing the way I recoiled when he reached out to pat my shoulder. These accounts, while circumstantial, began forming a picture of a girl living in fear. Meanwhile, Gerald grew more agitated. He started visiting more often, his tone clipped, his smiles too forced. Once when my mom left the room to get coffee, he leaned close and whispered, "You think you're clever, don't you? Letting all these people sniff around our business? Remember what I told you, lies will ruin you." His breath smelled like stale toffee, and the weight of his words pinned me down more than the IV lines ever could. But this time, something inside me shifted. For the first time, I wasn't completely alone. The doctors, the detectives, Mrs. Alvarez, they were beginning to see him for who he really was. Then came the undeniable proof. A radiology specialist reviewed my scans more thoroughly and discovered something telling. The fracture in my skull had a clear point of impact, consistent with being struck by a blunt object, not from slipping on a flat surface. Dr. Keene explained it to me carefully, laying out the evidence as if building a case in court. "Claire," he said, "this wasn't caused by slipping on the floor.
the force came from the side with a focused strike. It's not possible for this to be an accident the way it's been described. He looked me directly in the eye. This is important because it means you don't have to carry this truth alone. Science is speaking for you. I couldn't stop the tears from spilling over. The relief was sharp and overwhelming, like a dam cracking open inside me. For years, my reality had been twisted into lies I was forced to repeat, but now, here was something no one could dismiss or gaslight away. The fracture itself, etched in bone, told the story I was too afraid to speak. When my mom and Gerald came later that evening, they were met with the findings. Dr. Keene didn't mince words. "Mr. and Mrs. Moore," he said sternly, "the evidence shows this was not an accident. This type of injury suggests intentional trauma." My mother's face drained of color, her lips parting in silent disbelief. Gerald, however, scoffed. "So what, you're calling me a liar? Kids get hurt all the time. She's clumsy. Everyone knows it." But Dr. Keene didn't back down. "I'm calling it what it is. Abuse. And it's my duty to report it." He excused himself from the room, leaving behind a silence so heavy it felt like the walls themselves were pressing in. My mother buried her face in her hands while Gerald sat rigid, his fists clenched. That night was the longest of my life. Gerald didn't say much, but the look he gave me before leaving said everything. This wasn't over. He wasn't finished. And yet, for the first time, I felt the scales tilting in my favor. The undeniable proof was there, carved into my skull, written into medical reports, echoed in the testimonies of teachers and nurses who had seen the signs. Whether or not I could speak it aloud, the truth had finally gained a voice louder than Gerald's threats. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I realized something monumental. I was no longer the only witness to my suffering. The evidence had made me visible, undeniable, and impossible to dismiss, and that meant Gerald's grip on my life was beginning to weaken. After the radiology report, the tension in the house became almost unbearable. Gerald's mask, once so flawlessly charming, began to slip in subtle ways that I noticed despite myself. He no longer smiled freely when visitors came. His polite tone carried an edge, a barely contained threat. My mother, who had long been his shield, now shifted uneasily, caught between defending him and acknowledging the growing body of evidence that she could no longer ignore. I could see it in her eyes: fear, guilt, and confusion. The home that had once felt like a cage now seemed like a pressure cooker about to explode.
It was the night after Dr. Keene had firmly laid out the undeniable proof to both Gerald and my mom that everything inside me changed. I sat on my hospital bed, the white sheets cold against my skin, gripping the hospital-issued blanket like a lifeline. The steady beeping of the monitors reminded me I was alive, that I had survived the worst. But surviving wasn't enough anymore. The choice was clear. I could stay silent and let Gerald continue controlling my life, or I could finally speak, risk everything, and claim the truth that had been buried under years of fear and lies. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind raced through every memory of his abuse, the slaps, the shoves, the times he had screamed at me for doing nothing wrong. I recalled my mother standing by silently, telling me I was exaggerating. My journals flashed in my memory, each page a testament to the life I had endured in silence. For years, I had held back, scared of what would happen if I spoke. But now, armed with medical proof and the support of people outside the house, I realized I had a rare opportunity. The truth didn't belong to Gerald anymore, and it certainly didn't belong to my mother to suppress. The decision to speak didn't come easily. Fear gnawed at me, whispering that my mother might still turn against me, that Gerald would retaliate in ways I couldn't imagine. But for the first time, I understood that the power of truth wasn't in my words alone.
It was in the evidence, in the people who were now witnessing what had been hidden for so long. I thought about Dr. Keene, whose calm certainty had made me feel seen. Mrs. Alvarez, whose gentle insistence had reminded me I wasn't alone. And the detectives, whose presence signaled that the authorities could no longer ignore the abuse. If they could see it, then the truth had a momentum of its own. By morning, I felt a mixture of fear and determination that propelled me forward. I requested that Detective Ross and Haley come back to the hospital. When they arrived, I wasn't trembling as much as I had the first time. I had rehearsed in my mind the words I wanted to say, but when the moment came, they spilled out in fragments, trembling but undeniable. I told them everything I could remember, the shoves, the threats, the times I had tried to seek help and had been silenced. Each word lifted a weight I hadn't realized I had been carrying. Each sentence made me feel both vulnerable and empowered, like I was reclaiming pieces of myself that had been lost under Gerald's control. Detective Ross took careful notes while Haley listened. Neither interrupted, neither questioned the validity of my words. For the first time, I felt the kind of validation I had been denied for years. My voice, long suppressed, was finally being recognized as credible. My words were more than whispers in the dark. They were now part of a record that could protect me. When the police left that afternoon, they promised to coordinate with social services to ensure my safety upon discharge. My mother stayed with me in the hospital room afterward, her face pale and tight. "Claire," she started, but I cut her off gently. "Mom, I told them the truth. It's time we stop pretending." She shook her head slightly, tears welling in her eyes. I didn't know what to do. I was scared. I swallowed hard, the mix of anger and pity swirling inside me. Being scared doesn't make it okay to protect him instead of me, I said softly. She didn't respond, just nodded, finally acknowledging the weight of her choices. That evening, when I looked out the hospital window, the city lights glittered like 1,000 small reminders that the world outside didn't know my story, but it would soon. I thought about college applications, the life I wanted to build for myself, and the possibility of freedom from Gerald's shadow. I also thought about the risk, how he might react once he learned that I had spoken. But in that moment, the fear no longer paralyzed me. It was a constant hum, but it was no longer stronger than the need to stand up for myself. Even Gerald seemed to sense the shift. When my mother returned to the hospital with him the following day, his eyes scanned the room nervously, as if searching for some sign that he still had control. But he found none. I sat upright in bed, my gaze steady, and for the first time, I didn't flinch. My mother glanced at him, her shoulders slumping slightly, perhaps realizing that the role she had played in suppressing my truth had consequences she could no longer undo. Dr. Keene stopped by that afternoon. "Claire," he said gently, placing a hand on my shoulder, "what you did today, telling the authorities what happened, was incredibly brave. It's not just about this injury. It's about reclaiming your life. You've taken a step that many people never find the courage to take." His words sank in like sunlight piercing a stormy sky. For the first time, I felt a flicker of real hope. The long years of hiding, of feeling powerless, of living in fear, had led to this decisive moment. I had spoken, and the truth now had power beyond my own fear. That night, I finally slept without the same bone-deep dread pressing down on me. I dreamed of a life where I could move freely, speak openly, and exist without the constant shadow of Gerald's violence. The path ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, I felt the exhilarating mix of fear and courage that comes with standing up to a lifetime of lies. I had chosen truth. I had chosen to speak. And in doing so, I had set in motion a chain of events that would change everything.
After I had finally told the authorities everything I remembered, the world shifted in ways I had anticipated and in ways I had not. Gerald's calm facade fractured almost immediately. At home, the air became thick with tension, each room buzzing with unspoken threats. My mother's guilt was palpable, and I could see the way her hands trembled as she served breakfast or tried to make conversation, her eyes avoiding mine because she knew I had crossed a line she could not fix. Gerald, however, responded differently. His charm had turned into aggression masked with condescension. Every word he spoke now carried an edge of intimidation, and every glance felt like a warning that the fight was far from over. When social services came to interview my mother and Gerald separately, I watched from a distance in the hospital bed, trying to absorb the full impact of what I had set into motion. My mother had to answer questions she had long evaded about times I came home bruised, the shoves and slats she had witnessed, and the moments she had stood silently by. She faltered in her responses, offering vague answers, some of which seemed rehearsed, as if she were trying to protect Gerald or even herself from the consequences of her denial. Gerald, on the other hand, displayed a different kind of fury. He denied everything outright, his voice rising with the practiced intensity of a man who had long been able to intimidate everyone into submission. He claimed my injuries were accidents, my statements were exaggerations, and my mother had overreacted. But the presence of official documentation, the scans, Dr. Keene's report, the nurse's notes, made it impossible for him to control the narrative completely. Even during the small visits from Detective Ross and Haley, I could sense Gerald's mounting desperation. He showed up at the hospital multiple times, trying to charm and intimidate simultaneously. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," he told me once, leaning over the bed. "I'm doing what's best for you. You'll regret this if you push it." His breath smelled of tobacco, his eyes cold and calculating. I realized that this confrontation, while terrifying, was inevitable. The man who had held power over my life through fear and manipulation now faced a force he couldn't ignore: the truth, corroborated by evidence and witnesses. Meanwhile, the hospital staff and social workers meticulously gathered every piece of documentation they could. Medical reports detailed the severity of my skull fracture, the exact mechanism of injury, and the potential long-term effects. Statements from teachers, nurses, and even school counselors were compiled to establish a pattern of abuse. Mrs. Alvarez, the social worker, made regular visits to check on me, providing reassurance and slowly helping me process the growing complexity of the legal and protective steps being taken. Each document, each testimony, and each observation became a brick in a foundation that no lie or intimidation could overturn. At home, the mounting pressure was palpable. Gerald tried to assert control through subtle threats, lingering too long in doorways, commenting on the people visiting the hospital, and reminding my mother that everything could blow up if she didn't cooperate. He began monitoring my social media, questioning my friends about whether I had spoken to anyone, and showing up at school under the guise of concern. Every interaction was a calculated attempt to intimidate, to remind me that even though I had spoken, I was not entirely safe. But the confrontation didn't only play out through direct threats. It also came in the way Gerald and my mother argued quietly in my presence during hospital visits. My mother pleaded with him to step back, to tone down his intensity. But Gerald was resolute, insisting that nothing had changed, that our life was still intact. Their arguments were veiled for outsiders, but I could read the subtext. He was losing his grip, and the unraveling of years of control terrified him. The pressure wasn't limited to the home. Social services had begun coordinating with school officials and local law enforcement to ensure my safety and to conduct a thorough investigation. They visited the school, spoke to teachers, and began gathering evidence of ongoing abuse. My journals, hidden at home, were subpoenaed as potential documentation of a long-term pattern. And though I worried about Gerald discovering them, the protective measures in place ensured their safety.
These actions made Gerald's aggression more pronounced. He was no longer able to manipulate the situation behind closed doors as he had for years. Every move he made now had to contend with professionals who had authority he couldn't undermine.
Amid the chaos, I noticed a change within myself. The fear that had once paralyzed me began to coexist with a sense of empowerment. I realized that while Gerald could attempt to intimidate, he could no longer erase the truth. The documentation, the outside witnesses, and the legal framework being established were stronger than his threats. Each interaction, each piece of evidence gathered, fortified my resolve. I no longer flinched when his shadow loomed near. I understood that the system had begun to tilt in my favor. But it wasn't without cost. Every phone call, every visit, every hint of investigation was a reminder of the danger I had faced and would continue to face until Gerald's full accountability was established. My mother's guilt and hesitation weighed heavily on me as I realized she had been complicit in the silence that allowed abuse to continue for so long. Still, in the hospital, surrounded by professionals who validated my experience, I felt a growing clarity. The confrontation with Gerald was inevitable, but the scales had shifted. The power that had once belonged to fear now belonged, in part, to undeniable truth, corroborated by evidence and observation. And I was no longer alone. By the end of the week, it became clear that the confrontation with Gerald was no longer theoretical. His tactics of intimidation had been documented, his denials countered by medical proof, and the professionals involved were preparing to act decisively. For the first time, I felt that I had a real chance to reclaim my life, not just from the immediate danger, but from the years of manipulation and control that had defined my existence. The mounting pressure wasn't just a threat. It was the first tangible step toward justice. Even though the truth was out and professionals had begun to see what I had long suffered, the weight of reality hit me harder than I could have imagined. Hospital visits, interviews, and legal meetings drained me physically and emotionally, leaving me hollowed and raw. Each time Gerald showed up, even at a distance or through whispered phone calls, the fear resurfaced like a tidal wave, threatening to drown the hope I had painstakingly built. The evidence was solid, the professionals were on my side, yet the most painful truth lingered. My mother had chosen to protect him for so long, and even now she wavered between guilt and self-preservation. Her ambivalence cut me more than any threat Gerald could make. The lowest point came during a quiet night in my hospital room. The moonlight filtered through the blinds, casting stripes across the bed where I lay, my head still bandaged, and my body exhausted from the constant emotional strain. I stared at the ceiling, replaying Gerald's words in my head, his threats and veiled promises of retaliation echoing endlessly. "You'll regret this if you push it," he had whispered the day before. And in the dark, that whisper became a chorus of doubt. For a moment, I questioned every choice I had made. Had I been too reckless in telling the authorities? Had I endangered myself even more by speaking? The phone rang suddenly, and my heart jumped. It was my mother. She hesitated, then spoke softly. "Claire, I'm sorry. I didn't know what to do. Her voice broke, and I could hear the strain, the fear, and the guilt, all wrapped together in her trembling tone. I wanted to comfort her, to tell her it was okay, but instead I felt a wall of anger rising inside me. How many years had I endured this, believing her words were my shield, only to find it was just another layer of betrayal? I hung up the phone, feeling more alone than ever, even as I was surrounded by nurses and doctors who wanted to protect me. Sleep that night was fleeting. My dreams were filled with shadows, distorted versions of Gerald looming over me, my mother standing silently by, the hospital walls closing in. I awoke repeatedly, drenched in sweat, the panic in my chest rising every time I thought of what awaited me outside these walls. The hospital, which had been a sanctuary, now felt like a cage, a place where I had to wait for justice that could not arrive quickly enough. The evidence was strong, the authorities involved, yet fear and doubt gnawed relentlessly at me.
During one particularly long afternoon, I was alone with Mrs. Alvarez. was. She sat in the chair beside my bed, clipboard in hand, watching me carefully. "Claire," she said gently, "it's okay to feel scared, overwhelmed, or even regretful. What you've done is brave, but it's a lot for anyone to carry. You're allowed to feel the weight of it." Her words were meant to comfort me, but they also confirmed the reality. The journey towards safety and justice would not be simple, and the emotional toll was already immense. I nodded silently, unable to articulate the whirlwind of emotions inside me. The helplessness and fear were intertwined with tiny sparks of courage that seemed to flicker with every conversation, every step taken by the authorities. By evening, I was physically exhausted, my body weak from hospital food, lack of sleep, and the constant stress. The room felt suffocating, the walls pressing in, as though the very air carried Gerald's presence. I thought about the weeks ahead, the investigations, court dates, potential confrontations, and felt the magnitude of what I had undertaken. Speaking the truth had been the hardest decision of my life, but it had also made the consequences real and unavoidable. For the first time, I truly understood the depth of courage it would take to see this through. The breaking point of the night came when I looked in the small mirror above the sink across the room. My reflection was pale, dark circles under my eyes, hair disheveled, bandages still wrapped around my head. The girl staring at me seemed fragile, yet there was a glimmer of something stronger in her eyes. I realized then that despite the fear, despite the isolation and the uncertainty, I had already begun to reclaim a part of myself that Gerald and my mother had tried to suppress for years. That realization didn't erase the terror, but it gave me something I hadn't had before, a flicker of resolve that I could hold on to even in the darkest moments. When I finally drifted into a shallow sleep, it was with the understanding that the next steps would be even more challenging. Gerald would not yield easily. My mother's loyalty would continue to complicate the path forward. The outside world would test my resolve. But the undeniable proof of my abuse existed now in the hands of professionals who could act. The fear and the pain were real, but so was the momentum of truth that had begun to build. I slept with that precarious balance in mind, terror and hope, doubt and courage, knowing that tomorrow I would need every ounce of strength to move forward, to confront Gerald, and to face the consequences of the truth I had finally spoken. The courtroom was unlike anything I had ever imagined. The harsh fluorescent lights cast a sterile glare across the rows of chairs, and the low murmur of whispered conversations filled the air. Everything smelled faintly of varnished wood and polished floors, a strange combination that made my stomach churn. I sat beside Mrs. Alvarez, my hands clenched tightly in my lap, feeling the cool metal of my hospital bracelet. It was a tangible reminder of how far I had come, of the months I had spent in fear, and of the long road that had led me to this moment. I tried to steady my breathing, knowing that once the proceedings began, there would be no turning back. This was the final push, the climax where truth would stand face to face with the lies Gerald had spent years constructing. The judge entered first, her robe flowing, her expression unreadable, immediately commanding the attention of the room. Gerald was already seated, his polished facade on full display, suit impeccably tailored, hair perfectly combed. He looked calm, almost serene, but the tension in his hands betrayed the nervous energy beneath. My mother sat beside him, eyes downcast, her face pale and rigid. I couldn't tell whether her silence was shame, fear, or resignation. Across the aisle, Detective Ross and Haley, along with the child advocate assigned to the case, were quietly reviewing their notes, ready to present evidence that could no longer be ignored. When the prosecutor called my name, my knees nearly buckled under the weight of anticipation. I walked to the stand, each step echoing loudly in the otherwise quiet room, and took a seat. The microphone hovered before me, and I swallowed hard, my mouth dry,
my hands trembling. I remembered the months of preparation, the careful encouragement from Dr. Keene and Mrs. Alvarez, and the countless hours I had spent rehearsing the story I had lived for years in silence. My throat ached, but I knew I had to speak. This was the moment when the truth would no longer be mine alone. It would be seen, heard, and documented for everyone to acknowledge.
The questioning began with a calm, measured tone. "Claire," the prosecutor asked, "can you tell the court about the incident that brought you here?" I took a deep breath and recounted the night of the assault, my words deliberate but steady. I described the shove, the way my head hit the counter, the excruciating pain that followed, and my mother's dismissal when I tried to explain. I watched Gerald's face for the first time in months, his eyes narrowing, his jaw tightening, but I did not flinch. The truth was no longer just a fragile secret. It had the weight of evidence, of scans, medical records, and witness statements backing it up. Next, the medical team was called to testify. Dr. Keene stood confidently before the court, pointing to scans and diagrams that illustrated the severity and mechanics of my injury. "This is not consistent with a simple fall," he explained, his voice steady and authoritative. "The fracture's trajectory, depth, and impact points all indicate an intentional blow. The injury could have resulted in life-altering consequences, and it's critical to recognize the circumstances in which it occurred." Each word he spoke chipped away at the carefully constructed lies Gerald had spent years crafting. Witnesses from school followed, recounting moments they had observed but never spoken of at the time. Mrs. Randall described the days I had arrived with bruises, the long sleeves in warm weather, the way I flinched when touched unexpectedly. Other teachers corroborated her observations, detailing instances where they had seen Gerald's controlling presence at school and the fear it instilled in me. Each account painted a vivid, undeniable picture of abuse that had been invisible to the outside world for too long. When it was Gerald's turn to respond, he tried to maintain his composure. He denied everything, claiming accidents, clumsiness, and exaggeration. But the evidence was overwhelming, and even his practiced charm could not override the weight of the testimony. The judge listened, patient but firm, allowing him to speak, but clearly unconvinced by his denials. My mother, too, was questioned. Her answers were hesitant, her voice barely above a whisper. She admitted to seeing certain incidents, but had been too fearful to intervene. Her admission, though painful for me to hear, confirmed the reality of my lived experience, further solidifying the truth the court now faced. By the time I left the stand, a strange mixture of exhaustion and relief had settled over me. I had spoken, I had been heard, and the documentation of my pain was now undeniable. The weight of years of silence, the constant fear of retaliation, and the burden of secrecy had finally been lifted, even if only partially. Outside the courtroom, I could feel the eyes of my mother and Gerald watching me, but I no longer felt the same dread. I had faced the antagonist directly, and the truth had survived intact. The verdict, delivered after a tense deliberation, validated everything I had endured. Gerald's actions were officially recognized as abuse, and he was held accountable under the law. Protective measures were put in place, ensuring my immediate safety and creating a barrier between me and further harm. My mother, though struggling with guilt, began to acknowledge her complicity and the necessity of change. I realized that while her journey towards understanding would take time, my own path forward was now clearer. Walking out of the courtroom, I felt the tension that had coiled within me for years begin to unwind. The city streets outside were bustling, oblivious to the courtroom drama, but to me, they seemed full of possibility. The fear and isolation that had defined my life were no longer absolute. The truth had been presented, witnessed, and validated. For the first time as long as I could remember, I felt a measure of freedom.
I had reclaimed a voice that had been silenced, and in doing so, I had taken control of my life. Though the road ahead was still fraught with challenges, including repairing the fractured relationships and navigating the aftermath of the legal process, I walked away from the trial with something I had never possessed: the knowledge that the truth, once recognized and supported by undeniable proof, could not be ignored. It was a power stronger than fear, stronger than intimidation, and stronger than years of silence. In that moment, I understood that my courage had not only protected me, but had begun to dismantle the control Gerald had long held, paving the way for a life defined by my own terms. The weeks after the trial were a mixture of relief, adjustment, and reflection. The legal proceedings had ended, and Gerald's control over my life had been officially broken. He was facing serious consequences, including supervised probation and mandatory counseling, and social services had established protections to ensure my safety moving forward. Yet, even with the law on my side, the emotional aftermath was complex. The fear that had been ingrained in me for so long didn't disappear instantly. It lingered like a shadow, whispering doubts whenever I was alone. But alongside it, there was a growing sense of liberation, a realization that the long years of silence and endurance had culminated in accountability and recognition.
I spent my mornings recovering in a temporary safe home, surrounded by support I had never truly known before. Mrs. Alvarez, along with a team of social workers, teachers, and medical professionals, helped create a routine that balanced safety with independence. Slowly, the daily rhythms of school, friendships, and extracurricular activities re-entered my life. Each day brought small victories: a walk without fear of confrontation, a phone call with a friend without anxiety, or simply sleeping without a tight knot of dread coiling in my chest. Every ordinary moment felt extraordinary because it was unshackled from the constant tension Gerald had maintained for years. My mother's path toward reconciliation and understanding was slower and more turbulent. She began attending counseling sessions to confront her own role in my suffering and to untangle the fear that had kept her complicit. There were moments of conflict between us, moments when my anger surfaced, raw and unfiltered, accusing her for the silence that had enabled Gerald. Yet, over time, these moments evolved into conversations that, while difficult, allowed for recognition, apology, and tentative rebuilding of trust. I realized that justice wasn't just legal, it was also the work of confronting and untangling the emotional complexities that had defined our family life for years. At school, life began to normalize in ways I hadn't thought possible. Teachers, who had once only observed and documented, now provided mentorship and encouragement. Mrs. Randall, in particular, took extra care to ensure that I had the support I needed to thrive academically and emotionally. My peers, too, offered validation and companionship, some expressing admiration for the courage I had shown, others simply offering the gift of normal friendship without judgment. It was a subtle yet profound reminder that while Gerald's abuse had been isolating, the outside world could offer community, understanding, and recognition. Medical follow-ups became a critical part of my new equilibrium. Dr. Keene monitored my recovery, not just physically, but emotionally as well. He explained how traumatic injuries like mine could leave lasting effects on cognition and emotional regulation, and he encouraged therapy alongside the medical treatment to ensure holistic healing. I began seeing a psychologist who specialized in trauma, and slowly, through guided conversations, I began processing not just the abuse itself, but the years of fear, silence, and self-doubt that had accompanied it. Each session was a step toward reclaiming my identity, my autonomy, and my voice. The sense of vindication was gradual, not instantaneous. It came in quiet moments, receiving a school award for academic improvement, speaking openly in counseling sessions without flinching, and even laughing without the nagging guilt of anticipating reprimand. It was reinforced every time I reflected on the trail of evidence, testimony, and truth that had dismantled Gerald's power.
My courage, once hidden beneath layers of fear, had been acknowledged by professionals, validated in court, and supported by a network of people who had believed me when it mattered most. The realization that I had not only survived, but had actively reclaimed agency over my life became the cornerstone of my new equilibrium. I also began channeling my experience into helping others. I participated in workshops organized by child advocacy groups, sharing my story anonymously to educate peers and caregivers about recognizing and addressing abuse. Speaking to others, even indirectly, gave me a sense of purpose beyond my personal vindication. I realized that the fight for justice was not just about Gerald's punishment, but also about preventing further harm and equipping others with the tools to speak up and protect themselves. My experience became a platform for awareness and empowerment, turning pain into actionable change. Throughout all this, my mother's involvement slowly shifting from complicity to partnership. We attended some sessions together, learning to communicate without fear or judgment, and she began to rebuild trust by acknowledging her past failures and supporting my autonomy. While our relationship was still fragile, there was progress, a recognition that the family unit, though forever changed, could still exist in a healthier, safer form. As the months passed, life began to feel less like survival and more like living. I developed routines that gave structure, stability, and small joys that had been absent for so long. Morning walks, studying for classes, laughter with friends, quiet nights reading by my bedroom window. Each day reinforced the knowledge that I had been seen, that my suffering had been validated, and that my voice had made a difference. The fear that had once dominated every thought now existed in the background, no longer a controlling force, but a reminder of the distance I had traveled. By the time I reflected on the years since the incident, I recognized a profound transformation. The abuse that had once defined my life no longer had the power to control it. Gerald's authority, once absolute, had been dismantled, and my mother, though flawed, had begun a journey of accountability and change. I had reclaimed my voice, my autonomy, and my sense of self-worth. I was not just surviving anymore, I was thriving with a clear understanding that the truth, once acknowledged, could empower, protect, and transform.
The morning sunlight spilled into my new room in a modest apartment provided by the Child Advocacy Program, filtering through thin curtains and painting the walls in soft gold. I stood by the window, feeling the warmth on my face, and for the first time in years, I breathed without the invisible weight of fear pressing down on me. The distant hum of traffic, the laughter of children playing in the street below, even the clatter of dishes from a neighbor's apartment, all of it seemed ordinary, mundane, and yet astonishingly liberating. I had learned to cherish small, ordinary moments, for they were the first true indicators of safety and freedom. This was the life I had fought for, and each day I spent in it reminded me of how far I had come from the shadows of Gerald's control. I had begun college courses part-time, determined to reclaim the education that had been disrupted by years of trauma. My mornings were filled with lectures and study sessions. My afternoons spent volunteering with a local support group for teens who had experienced abuse. The work was emotionally demanding, but it was also empowering. Every time I shared strategies, listened to a story, or offered reassurance to someone who felt trapped, I felt a flicker of purpose ignite within me. The sense of helplessness I had once carried had been transformed into actionable guidance and support for others navigating the dark corridors I knew so well. My trauma, once isolating, had become a bridge to connection and advocacy. At home, my routines were simple but stabilizing. I cooked my own meals, arranged my small apartment just the way I liked, and maintained a schedule that allowed me to focus on health, academics, and recovery. Dr. Keene continued to monitor my physical progress, while my therapist guided me through the emotional and psychological dimensions of healing. Each day, the skull fracture that had once been a symbol of violence and control now represented survival and resilience. I kept the scar faintly visible under short haircuts or light makeup, not as a mark of shame,
but as a quiet testament to the fact that I had endured and overcome. It was both a warning and a badge of courage, a reminder that even in the face of extreme adversity, the human spirit could persevere. My mother and I had begun rebuilding our fractured relationship. While there was still distance, a cautious acknowledgement of past mistakes, and an ongoing need for therapy, the lines of communication were open. She attended sessions with me occasionally, learning to navigate accountability and reconciliation, and each small step, an honest conversation, a gesture of support, a shared meal, felt monumental. The love between us had been tested almost to the breaking point, but now it had the potential to be reconstructed on a foundation of honesty and mutual understanding. I had also become a mentor to younger teens navigating similar experiences. Each workshop I led, each counseling session I volunteered in, reinforced a sense of agency and purpose I had long thought impossible. I spoke openly about recognizing signs of abuse, seeking help, and the importance of trusting their voices, knowing firsthand the difference it could make. The gratitude and recognition from those I helped became a mirror for my own growth, a reflection that even from trauma, strength, resilience, and empowerment could emerge. Social life, once stifled by fear and secrecy, gradually expanded. I reconnected with friends I had lost touch with during the years of hiding, forming new bonds with people who understood or at least respected the weight of my journey. I joined clubs, participated in community events, and began learning to embrace moments of joy without the constant expectation of danger. Each laugh shared, each night out, each quiet conversation over coffee became a testament to life reclaimed and autonomy regained. There were moments when the trauma still surfaced, flashbacks, unexpected anxiety, or pangs of fear when confronted with loud voices or certain tones, but I had learned to navigate them. Breathing exercises, grounding techniques, and immediate access to support networks allowed me to manage the residual impact of years of abuse. More importantly, I had cultivated the understanding that these moments did not define me. They were reminders of what I had endured, not what I was doomed to repeat. Legally, Gerald's consequences continued to solidify. Court-mandated programs, supervision, and ongoing oversight ensured that his ability to cause harm was limited. The sense of justice, once abstract and distant, had become tangible. It was not just a personal victory, it was a societal acknowledgement that abuse would not go unchecked, that victims could reclaim their lives, and that truth could prevail over deception. Every step in his accountability process reinforced the reality that courage, once coupled with undeniable evidence and support, could transform fear into protection. Looking out the window one afternoon, watching children play and neighbors going about their lives, I felt a profound sense of peace. My body had healed, my mind had begun to reclaim normalcy, and my voice, once suppressed, had become a tool for advocacy, justice, and connection. I realized that survival was no longer sufficient for me. I wanted to thrive. And thriving required not just living, but creating, nurturing, and helping others to navigate paths that I had once walked alone.
I picked up a journal, the same kind I had used in secret for years, and began writing. But this time, the entries were not for hiding, not for fear, not for proving that I existed under duress. They were for clarity, reflection, and guidance. An account of resilience, a roadmap for empowerment, and a testament to the enduring power of truth. The pen glided across the pages, each word a reaffirmation of life reclaimed, a reminder that transformation was ongoing, and that even in the darkest circumstances, the human spirit could rise, assert itself, and find purpose. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across my apartment, I closed the journal and looked around the room. Every object,
Every detail spoke of autonomy, survival, and triumph. The girl who had endured abuse, silence, and fear was gone. In her place stood someone forged by struggle, strengthened by courage, and empowered by truth. I was free, I was safe, and I had purpose. The transformation was complete, not just in circumstance, but in identity. I had turned pain into empowerment, secrecy into voice, and survival into a life that mattered. I was, at last, whole.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.